It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. A major shake-up in Downing Street as Sue Gray steps down as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff.
She'd become the distraction, and that's why she stepped aside.
So will her departure make any difference? Also today, Israelis remember the victims of the October the 7th terror attacks.
It is a day of deep reflection and pain, thinking about October the 7th.
Meanwhile, fresh Israeli airstrikes overnight in Lebanon. After a year of conflict, is a wider war moving closer? Joining us today, Foreign Office Minister Hamish Faulkner, Shadow Foreign Office Minister Harriet Baldwin, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn and columnist for the iPaper Andrew Fisher, and Zoe Strimple from The Sunday Telegraph. This is Politics Live. Welcome. Let's start with Labour's plans to impose VAT on private schools. They say it will fund 6,500 new teachers for state schools. There has been some debate in reports over the weekend about the timing of when these plans will actually come into force. They were due in January, but there has been something of a tussle with the Treasury. In part, it prompted this from Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, to tweet, "Our state schools need teachers more than private schools need embossed stationery. Our children need mental health support more than private schools need new pools. And our students need careers advice more than private schools need AstroTurf pitches." My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Hamish. Fair comment or the politics of envy?
I think Richard is making the fairly simple point that we were elected on a manifesto, that involved putting VAT on private schools and making sure that we both hire 6,500 new teachers and make sure there's mental health provision in all secondary schools, which is a massive issue across the country, including in my constituency in Lincoln.
Right, so fair comment.
It's clearly the politics of envy, and it's an example of Labour wanting to level down this country and make us really the only country in the Western world that actually taxes education, something which is something our country is very world renowned for.
I mean, just to remind our viewers, I think it's 93% of pupils are educated in the state school system and 7% around that in private schools. But what do you say in response to what Harriet said?
I think there's absolutely nothing about the politics of envy here. We were elected on a manifesto which was absolutely explicit on this point, and we're following through on that commitment.
I suppose it's the language that Bridget Phillipson has used. You both privately educated, I understand. You too, Hamish. Is that the correct juxtaposition in terms of justifying the policy?
I think Bridget is making you said 93% of people go to state schools. Clearly the first responsibility of a government is to be for the many, not the few, and we're trying to make sure that after 14 years in which schools have been run down, that we're trying to address that, and we've got to make tough decisions, and that's what we're doing.
Andrew?
The politics of justice. Look, this is a privilege. This is taking away a privilege from private schools. They've got a tax break. They were exempt from VAT. They are not a charity in the same way that an animal charity or a humanitarian charity is. They educate the children of the very, very rich, predominantly. So therefore, this is a tax break they don't need, and that funding would be better put into a state school system that educates 93% of our children, and quite rightly so. And I think Bridget Phillipson is right to put it. It's a slightly punchy way of putting it, but it's exactly right. Why on earth should private schools that are already better resourced than state schools get a tax break from the state? That's ludicrous.
So I completely disagree with the zero-sum game presented by those sorts of comments. In an ideal world, we should be having people who are able to pay, or those who get scholarships to fantastic private schools who can have as much embossed notepaper as the schools deem fit, and state sector, which is well funded and can provide mental health. And this is a bit of sort of rhetorical, sophistry, basically, to pretend that if we take away that from that, that will go to that. And that's a setup to make it seem like, the well-to-do have to be less well-to-do in order for the less well, the people at state education to have better provision. And I think that's lazy, and I think it's an unfortunate way of looking at things. There could be other ways of mobilizing funds, and should be. Lots of wastage, we know, in terms of state finances that could go into that. But I think this is perhaps not politics of envy, but the politics of spite. And I think if you scratch beneath that surface, it's unnecessary.
I mean, Zoe's comments are predicated on the idea that there's adequate provision for mental health in secondary schools that this government inherited, and it's just not the case.
One thing to add to that is the
hang
more
on.
you tax VAT on private schools, we're already seeing lots of people withdrawing from private schools. So that bit of your plan is
Well,
working,
we don't know if it's
but we don't.
Could be that people's mortgages have gone up because of the rates
but what we
going
do
up.
know is that if you disincentivize,
Range of
these things that you're going to draw on for your tax, you're soon going to end up without these entities at all.
In
Then
fact,
what
the
are you
costs
gonna
of
do?
private schools have gone up considerably above inflation over the last few
I
years,
still
and we
think
haven't
it's
seen a
zero-sum game
large-scale
that somehow
exodus.
aren't very
I mean, I suppose the question is about the sort of charitable status, if you like, too, and whether private schools deserve that and earn it.
Well, I think one of the things that will go by the wayside is some of these scholarships and bursaries. So I think actually everyone is worse off as a result of this policy.
All right. Well, the major story that dominated, certainly from yesterday afternoon, is the departure of Sue Gray as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Let's have a look at some of the front pages and how they are reporting. It is across almost all of them. But let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph. Sue Gray ousted as Prime Minister wields the knife. You then have the Express. Starmer Chief Sue Gray exits his sinking ship. And finally, in the Financial Times, Gray forced out as Starmer moves to get grip on number 10. Well, let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, hello to you. Why did the Prime Minister make this decision?
Yeah, hello to you, Jo. In the end, he concluded that it was unsustainable for her to continue in that job. There'd been a growing sense for quite a while that that was the likely outcome of all of this briefing, some of which were sent in my direction, others of which were sent elsewhere amongst the Westminster reporting fraternity about Sue Gray. Now, not all of that was necessarily fair. She'd become something of a lightning rod for a whole collection of grumbles that people had, either personally, some special advisors not getting contracts of employment quickly, and then also strategically, a sense from some within government that they hadn't adequately gripped the reality of coming into government and making the most of their first few months. And her high profile, courtesy of the job that she'd done before she went to work for Labour. As a civil servant, she was the author, of course, of that Partygate report, and during Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, I think heightened the extent to which she was a lightning rod. But fair or otherwise, the bottom line is the anger about her was real, and either the Prime Minister had to get rid of her, get rid of those who were grumbling. Problem there was quite a few of them, and actually finding them would be difficult because they were pretty discreet in their grumbling, or sort out the underlying issues. And sorting out the underlying issues without doing either of the first two things was going to be difficult. So in the end, he concluded he was willing to sack her, is my understanding. That conclusion had been come to at the tail end of last week. In the end, they managed to find this sort of mutually compatible kind of arrangement where she was sort of shunted downwards, demoted significantly into this alternative role in the Cabinet Office.
And we've talked a lot about Sue Gray over the past few months, culminating, of course, in her departure yesterday being announced. But what about the sort of new personnel coming in? I mean, they may not be familiar to our viewing public as such, but it is important to say that obviously they will be replacing, or a different flavour, if you like, at the top of government.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about all of this is a collection of people who are amongst the most important and influential people in the country that you're not meant to have heard of. And actually, that's part of this whole thing with Sue Gray. When you are an advisor and you become the story, that tends to mean you're not an advisor for very much longer. And it matters who a Prime Minister has around them, their skill set, and then the kind of organogram, how they work with each other. And crucially, do they actually get on with each other? And I think this attempted kind of reset will probably bring a sort of sharper political edge to the Downing Street operation, with Morgan McSweeney, long-standing ally of Keir Starmer, been there since he ran for the leadership, seen as the mastermind of Labour's election win, taking on that job of Chief of Staff. And then the bringing in of James Lyons, former Mirror and Sunday Times political journalist, went off to work for the NHS and then for TikTok in a more strategic communications role. I think that's an acknowledgement. It is an acknowledgement that they've perhaps not seized these first few months as much as they would have liked to, and they'll hope to sort of rectify this with this new configuration.
Right, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But briefly, also the speed with which this has happened, this shake-up, change of personnel, whatever you want to call it, has been, well, speedy in the sense they've only been in power, Labour, for a few months.
Yeah, that's the thing at the heart of all of this that I think is worth remembering. We've got used to turbulence in government over the last few years, but there have been big extraneous factors like a pandemic and war in Europe, etc., etc. There's also been the kind of friction of being in power for a long time, which in the end often leads to leaks and fallouts and all the rest of it. This new government have been around for 3 months, and yet there were figures so angry, so upset at what was going on. They were willing to kind of press the nuclear button and leak stuff to me about the salary of their boss. And you wonder, even with the removal of their former boss, if all of those enmities can be packaged up again and suddenly there'll be a nest of singing birds. That'd be quite a transition. That's the aim. That's what they're going to try and pull off. But
yes.
I think it's reasonable to be sceptical about whether they can pull it off.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. Hamish, what difference will this make to government?
So let me say, because I think Chris was alluding to the fact that Sue is an advisor, so she can't really defend herself in the media. She's a dedicated public servant, both for Keir Starmer in opposition and in the civil service. There's obviously been a decision that she should move on, and I want to thank her for that service. I think, honestly, that you mentioned the fact that it's happened quite quickly. The Prime Minister is ruthlessly focused on making sure he's got the right setup.
Or just ruthless, maybe.
And he's taken action quickly to try and make sure that that's
well,
what
it's speedy if you compare it to previous administrations, whether they be Conservative or Labour, in terms of what we call in politics a reset, if you like, happening so fast once Labour has come into power. And I say again, what difference is it going to make? Is it going to be harmonious at number 10? Is the delivery of policies going to improve as a direct result of this?
Well, look, I think it's actually not that unusual that the pressures of opposition and the pressures of government are quite different. So I don't think it's that unusual that you take a look at around the 100-day point about whether or not you want to make changes, and that's obviously what they've decided to do.
I think it is quite unusual for a Chief of Staff to go in that short amount of time. But what difference do you think it will make? You welcome it, I presume.
No,
you want a more streamlined and certainly a government that's delivering.
If you're talking to me, I think it shows that it's a complete shambles, and I think that this is the woman that the Prime Minister appointed while he was in opposition to help him run the country. It's a big and difficult job, and he found someone who had extensive experience in terms of being a senior civil servant. And what this government is showing itself to be is not just chaotic, not just delivering on its failing to deliver on its missions, but also, you know, completely shameless in terms of its self-service and just all these gifts and entertainment and the £107,000 worth of things that the Prime Minister himself has declared.
Let's get Hamish. We might come to
shocked.
Well, I mean, after, of course, a certain amount of chaos and what Keir Starmer used to call the psychodrama of the psychodrama, but then the psychodrama continues.
I mean, there is absolutely no comparison between the total chaos, where they lost a Prime Minister that quicker than the Chief of Staff has left. The Chief of Staff, I mean, Keir Starmer has inherited, as we all have, an absolutely diabolical mess from the Conservatives. The fact that he is moving quickly to try and make sure that he's got the right setup, I think, is to be applauded rather than to act as if though this is some sort of disaster. We are delivering for the British public. In Lincoln, we have already been able to deliver on a whole range of things, from stopping
their winter fuel allowance,
stopping the absolutely insane scheme at RAF Scampton that was bothering people, a pay rise for the doctors in Lincoln Hospital. We are getting on with the job, and honestly, nobody in Lincoln cares about who the advisors are in number 10. They care about whether or not
they
the
care about their winter fuel allowance.
Right.
I'm happy to talk about the winter fuel allowance, but that wasn't the question that was put to us. The question is about Sue Gray, and you're putting it to me that we are more chaotic than you were. I mean, there's a bit of a plausibility problem with that attack.
Will it change things at number 2? Will there be a discernible difference for all of us?
Probably not, because at the end of the day, advisors advise and politicians decide. And, you know, Dennis Skinner, I remember having a pop at Jeremy Hunt a few years back, said when posh boys are in trouble, they sack their servants. And there's an element of that here, obviously a middle-class boy rather than a posh boy, perhaps. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, the problems that Labour has got are predominantly political. They are the winter fuel allowance, as Harriet just said. That is deeply unpopular. You look at Labour's polling, Keir Starmer's polling, Rachel Reeves' polling. It's all gone very sharply downhill since that. Their complete support, which I'm sure we'll get onto, for Israel's ongoing atrocities, which has obviously had an electoral impact as well. That is still having an impact in the polls. And, of course, the freebies row, which is not on the scale of the criminality, actually, we saw under the Conservatives, but is an irritant, especially when you see somebody on a six-figure salary getting lots of freebies when at the same time they're taking away £300 from people who are 80 years old, who might be on 11,000. So there are problems. They are not about advisors. They are about politicians' poor judgment.
I just have to jump in and say one of the major political problems with this government isn't ongoing support for Israel's so-called atrocities. It's the exact
So-called?
opposite
Hang on,
of
we'll
that
come on to
support,
this.
but we'll get to that later. It is the total betrayal of a very important cause. Anyway, from an outsider's perspective, I think the Sue Gray, I can't let sort of actual.
All right, no, but as I say, we'll
lies.
no, hang on,
Yes,
hang on.
actual.
So Israel isn't committing war crimes or ethnic cleansing?
That's straight out of the Hamas playbook.
Zoe
for
and
God's
Andrew,
sake. That is ridiculous.
We'll get to
Andrew
that.
and
No,
Zoe, I've
that is
already said
ridiculous.
twice. No, I'm going to stop
I'm
you.
not going to be called Hamas. I'm sorry, that is ridiculous.
No, I am
It's absurd.
in charge of
I
this
don't know.
programme,
I'd be
and we'll
interested in
talk
how you
about
differ.
it. We're going to come on to it next
yes,
and try
so I
and
wanna say
remember
that the Sue Gray-
that it is a year on from the October 7th
and as the
massacres.
only Jew
right.
on the panel, I object to being shouted at by someone.
All
who
right,
has-
we'll come
or
on to it in a
insulted
moment.
or whatever.
It didn't insult you.
Okay, just remember the optics. Okay, of who you're talking to.
Yeah, all right, Zoe,
Right.
come on, back to the point.
So I think the point is here for average. Yeah, most people don't give two hoots about the nitty-gritty of the staffing of Keir Starmer. But what they have noticed is what appears to be, I think the overall look is that this has been one of the worst honeymoon periods in history for this government. And the freebie issue is obviously the dominating one. The one thing I would think was the thing that strikes me with Sue Gray is that she appeared to be incredibly competent and, as you said, Harriet, experienced. I can't help but wonder if there's noses put out of joint. I mean, I think sometimes women who go in and are extremely acute in the way they go about things, and we've heard that she's kind of demanded to kind of look at the things about who's been briefing against various people. Maybe people don't like aspects of a woman having a style like
And we're
that.
we're seeing images of Sue Gray with Keir Starmer and at other various events. So what do you want to say to that? Because during the election, Labour promised to end the so-called chaos that you have talked about in terms of the Conservatives. And Keir Starmer said his government would tread more lightly on people's lives, implying that his administration would be quietly getting on with the job. What went wrong?
Well, look, I think, honestly, Sue Gray is treading pretty lightly on people's lives. This is not a story which I think the country is very focused on. As Andrew rightly said, we are the politicians. Judge us. Sue cannot defend herself. She's done the country fine service. If you want to criticise the Prime Minister, criticise the Prime Minister. Yeah. He is the person who's
but
elected.
We are talking about here the leadership. What went wrong with Keir Starmer promising to tread more lightly on people's lives and that they would be getting on with it quietly?
I mean, we are getting on with it, and we are trying to get on with it quietly, but we have been given an absolutely diabolical inheritance, which even the OBR has said. Even the OBR has said. Even the OBR has said.
You chose and voted to cut the winter fuel allowance of a 90-year-old widow on £13,000 a year. That is unbelievably atrocious.
And proposed by the Conservative Party in previous manifestos.
No, 14 years we never went near in that cut. And so I think, you've got to put it in the context of what your constituents are experiencing, and you will have lots of vulnerable older people really worried about getting through this winter because they haven't got their winter fuel allowance. I am truly...
Well, let him respond.
Since you mentioned my constituents, my constituents, of course, people are writing to me about the winter fuel allowance, but I'll tell you what I had all the way through the campaign was concern about my elderly mother cannot get an ambulance in time. I'm worried about delays in the hospital. You left public services in such a mess. You then overspent on a whole range of things, including the Rwanda scheme, on PPE for COVID. You left the finances in such a bad state. We've had to make brutally difficult decisions.
Well, fastest growing economy in the G7 and inflation under control. But
I just want, just before we move on, because we were at the conferences, keen viewers will have noticed, and we were at the Labour conference in Liverpool at the end of last month, and we spoke to Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester and also a former Cabinet Minister in Gordon Brown's government, and I asked him about all the speculation then around Sue Gray. This is what he had to say.
Can I tell you one change I really don't want to see, and that's anything that pushes Sue Gray aside. Sue Gray has been an absolute breath of fresh air for the mayors and for devolution in England. She has really brought us to the centre of things. The government won't achieve their missions unless we're really empowered to go for growth and to build those homes, to get more people into work. And Sue has really brought things together so that we're really at the heart of things. And I would say that I would like to see the departure of people from Downing Street briefing against Sue Gray.
Well, he was pretty defiant there. Have the wrong people gone, or the wrong person gone?
Look, I am not in a position to provide detailed commentary on what happens within Number 10, but I hope everyone can see I'm not for 1 second saying that I think Sue Gray has done anything wrong. It's up to the Prime Minister to have a team that works for him in Number 10, and those are his choices, and I'm sure Andy is right in what he says, that Sue was, I know, worked in a dedicated way with the mayors in the regions to try and make sure their voice was heard in Whitehall, and that's the right thing to do.
We're going to move on because people across Israel are remembering last year's 7th of October attacks when Hamas, a proscribed terrorist organisation by many countries, including the UK, Hamas took 1,200 people, massacred them, mostly Israeli citizens. You can see people here at the site of the Nova Music Festival, from where many of them were taken, and from nearby kibbutzim. And 250 were taken hostage. According to the BBC, 97 still remain held captive somewhere in Gaza. Now, since then, Israel has carried out an extensive, unrelenting military operation in Gaza, during which nearly 42,000 people, mostly civilians, have been killed, according to the Hamas-run Health Ministry, and much of Gaza has been devastated, while Israel pursues its war aims, it says, to degrade Hamas as an organisation so it can never inflict another October the 7th, which the organisation has pledged to do. Now, since then, and more recently, the war has spread. These images that you can see now are of Beirut in Lebanon, as Israeli strikes continue in another military operation to root out Hezbollah, the Iranian-sponsored terror group from southern Lebanon, where they have waged a campaign of rocket attacks on northern Israel. But over the last year, particularly in the last month or so, more than 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon, as I say, most of them in recent weeks, with thousands more injured. Now, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, who was the head, effectively, of Hezbollah nearly 2 weeks ago, prompted a barrage of missile attacks on Israel by Iran, a region that many politicians now say is on the brink of a wider war. Let's talk to Dr. Sanam Fakil. She joins us from Chatham House. She's the director of the Middle East and North Africa programme. Sanam, welcome to you. Today, obviously, is a very, very sombre day for many people, but for Israel, a country traumatised what happened on October the 7th a year ago. But what are the political implications of the ongoing war now across the region?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. This is certainly a very somber day, and I think we should remember the victims in Israel, but across the Middle East, Palestinians, Lebanese, and beyond. This has been a very traumatic year for many people. 1 year on, the war is spreading. It is not finished in Gaza. In fact, Israel has remobilized and is still trying to achieve its war aims in Gaza. And I think that's quite troubling. And we have to reflect on that. The war has broadened now to Lebanon, with Israel attempting to also degrade Hezbollah's military capabilities and prevent Hezbollah from threatening Israel's security, which is legitimate. But this is, of course, having deep impact across Lebanese society and impacting ordinary people in a way that is not easily understood here in London. And finally, of course, on October 1st, we saw Iran hit Israel for a second time in this year with missiles. The missile attack was a surprise to many and didn't impact damage on the ground. But of course, we have been waiting for a few days now for Israel's response. And many people, myself included, are very worried that we could be on the brink of a wider and more dangerous escalation in the Middle East.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that killing Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah was a step towards changing the balance of power in the region for years to come. We've also heard from the Israeli ambassador to London, who said we're creating a new Middle East. What does that mean?
I would challenge them to explain that. Taking out, of course, the leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas is certainly an important tactical victory, but changing the balance on the power in the ground moves beyond military tactics and actually has to translate into changes within the Lebanese system, the complete dismantling of Hezbollah or Hamas, which doesn't happen through a military operation on its own. It happens through changes of governance, enforcement of accountability. Lebanon has been without a government, without an elected president. It has a caretaker system in place now. So those are the meaningful changes that need to take place. On the Palestinian side, if you really want to change the equation on the ground, Israeli leaders have to be able to say the word Palestine and talk about a process that can address Palestinian self-determination. Military gains on the battlefield alone do not change the equation on the ground anywhere, let alone in the Middle East.
Just briefly, before you go, Dr. Sanam Fakil, political support for a Palestinian state in Israel itself, it's gone down, clearly, quite significantly since October the 7th. That's not surprising. But what are we talking about?
Well, of course, it's gone down because Israeli leaders are not presenting that as an opportunity for Israelis to consider, to think about reinvigorating a process that would try to see Israelis and Palestinians coexist, live side by side. What you need is a process that addresses accountability, governance, and the right to choose on the Palestinian side. Palestinians have not engaged in elections for 20 years. They have leadership challenges of their own that need to be addressed. But within Israel itself, there is a constituency that is trying to think of a different solution. Security cannot be achieved only in the barrel of a gun, and Israelis need leaders that will begin to talk about the so-called day after. Israel talks about tactics in Gaza and Lebanon and vis-a-vis Iran. Israel is not talking about what comes next, and that is problematic.
Dr. Sanam Fakil, thank you very much. And before we open the discussion here, I just want to ask everyone to be as respectful as possible, if we can. Starting with you, Hamish, because you're the Minister responsible for the Middle East. What do you think the UK response to the recent developments in the region following, yes, Iran's barrage of missiles, but also the ongoing military operation that Israel is carrying out in southern Lebanon?
So let me just acknowledge the date. It's clearly a year since what was the worst attack on Israel in its history and the worst attack on Jews since the Second World War. This is a terribly solemn day, and I think you're going to hear from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons later today, and I'll be going to join the Jewish community in Manchester after this programme. I used to be a hostage negotiator before I became a politician, and I know how tortured people in Israel and across the world, including with a UK national who's still held by Hamas, will be from this year of torture that everybody has had. What are we doing in the region? So we are urging de-escalation on all sides. So when we were elected as the government, we urged an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and we're now calling for a ceasefire across the blue line in Lebanon. We clearly, as Dr. Fakil said, we are clearly in an incredibly dangerous and delicate moment in the Middle East. We do not want to see escalation. Of course, Israel has a right under international humanitarian law to defend itself.
But does it have a right, if it decides to, extend its military operation to hitting sensitive targets in Iran, for example?
So I'm not going to give a operational commentary on each individual strike of this, but I want to be clear. What is the British government calling for in the region? We're calling for de-escalation, not escalation.
Well, it's how you get there. Harriet, if you were in government, what would you be saying and doing?
Well, I think the appropriate thing to say is that given that it has been a year, it is a point to remember exactly what triggered this terrible escalation of events. And I feel sure that we would be also calling for de-escalation, but we would also be reiterating, particularly on this day, that you can see that this was a horrendous attack on Israel and the Israeli people, that these hostages have now been held for a year, that the country has come under a sort of increasingly existential attack over the last year, including now directly from Iran. And it is, I think, the first step to moving to that process of de-escalation, to liberate the hostages unconditionally and immediately.
Right, before any discussion of something like a Palestinian state?
I think absolutely, yes. Let's get things de-escalating by liberating those hostages.
The problem is Israel's security. It wants to be secure, but these military operations will not guarantee Israel's future security, will it? They've already evacuated tens of thousands of Israeli citizens from the northern part of the country. There are tens of thousands of Gazans and Palestinians who lie dead. How will that guarantee Israel's security?
So, firstly, it's strange to me that we're suddenly applying some sort of guarantee outlook on geopolitics exclusively to Israel. Of course, there are no guarantees, but what Israelis know, and what I think it seems preposterous to people who've been inside Israel, and to many Jews who feel emotionally very connected to this issue, because it is literally the place we go if there's another Holocaust or a threatened Holocaust, is that there is sort of 70,000 people roughly literally have been camping out in hotels in Tel Aviv for a year. They cannot go home because there are rockets constantly firing. It's not safe for them to go home. There is no sort of like, well, if we can't guarantee by military, so what are they supposed to do? Just never go home?
So
this
what
is still
are the
part
policy,
of sovereign.
so what are the policy outcomes?
So, I think that the best first policy that Israel can and is doing, of course, has to be a show of force. You can't just sit down with Hezbollah and say, excuse me, do you mind withdrawing back to the Litani River, as you were supposed to do from UN Resolution 1701, and maybe kind of de-infest yourself from civilian houses on the border and stop firing rockets at willy-nilly. And, we know now that they wanted to come in on the day after on October 7th, but they weren't sort of in the loop enough about it. There's a very everyday, real question for Israelis. Can they go home and be safe or not? Now, here in the relative comfort of the West, we like to kind of pontificate about whether, well, we'd rather have de-escalation and we'd rather the region not go into all-out war. These people need to get home. And dialogue is not part of that picture. Well, it would be great if after the military, I agree entirely that the military solution cannot be the entire solution. But nobody can possibly come up with a plausible alternative.
All right. Well, Hamish, you're a Foreign Office Minister. Just before I come to you, Andrew, what do you say? Dialogue cannot be possible at this early stage, says Zoe.
I just don't think that's right. I think that when you look at the negotiations that Amos Hochstein, the American envoy, was conducting about a plan based on 1701, there was a diplomatic process. I understand the frustration in Israel and across the region.
Well, hang on.
But there were ongoing talks. We were clear that we wanted to see a ceasefire in Lebanon, and that remains our position.
Can I just say, hang on, 2,600 rockets have hit Israel in the last year. This isn't just a theory. This isn't sort of let's call for it. 2,000.
All right. Let
me just be clear, Jo. That I condemn Lebanese Hezbollah's attacks on Israel. Absolutely, they are an Iranian proxy. Iran is driving the region to the brink of total conflagration, and I absolutely criticise Iran for what they are doing. But if you ask what is going to get both Israelis and Lebanese civilians back into their homes, is in the end going to need to be a political solution negotiated through diplomats.
And what is that political solution? What is the policy outcome? Because at the moment it isn't clear.
We came very close in the early 90s when you had two statesmen on both sides, actually, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, who, with the support of the US and others, did come very close to a settlement. And unfortunately, the West and politicians within Israel and within Palestine have failed in the 30 years since to get anywhere close to that. And look, you will never get peace where there is not justice. And when a people are oppressed and denied statehood and, subject to awful atrocities over decades, as the Palestinian people have been, they are not going to, they're not going to peaceably live with that. Now, that doesn't justify at all what Hamas did, or anything Hamas has ever done, actually, or Hezbollah. They are atrocious terrorist organisations rightly prescribed in this country. I have no truck with them, just to be absolutely clear. But you can't say Hamas are terrible, therefore we will just bombard Palestine and raze virtually every building in Gaza to the ground, killing tens of thousands of civilians in the name of security. That is not a proportional response. And I would say that, as I did at the time when the US went into Afghanistan and I think made the situation worse then. Look at us 20 years on. We haven't resolved that. The Taliban are back in charge. Likewise in Iraq, which we've left in a worse state. So I'm consistent on this. And I think the reality is you will only ever get a just settlement by getting all sides around the table. Unfortunately, again with Iran, the Trump, I think, exploding of the Iran nuclear deal did not help. In terms of our relations, being able to negotiate with Iran, which is a problem. That was contained in some form for a while because of that deal. And unfortunately, Trump unilaterally broke it, which was negotiated with the EU as well. And that has not helped the situation either. But it's a very complex picture and we do need to talk and we do need everybody to step back from the brink. That's obviously very difficult because there are huge emotions on all sides of this. Because people have lost loved ones, innocent loved ones who don't deserve to die. And unfortunately, with the exception of Nasrallah and a few others, it's not the guilty parties who die, it's innocent Israeli civilians, it's innocent Palestinian and Lebanese civilians.
I just want to jump in quickly with that. Of course, many innocent civilians have died, which is a tragedy. However, the fact that these terrorist groups, especially Hamas, use civilian shields as central to their entire sort of war strategy means that they have wanted those civilians to die when Israel has, Israel actually takes pains to avoid killing children. The other thing, just to know about figures. It does. I mean, this is a well-documented thing. If you look at any,
but it doesn't always look like that,
does it?
It doesn't, and it doesn't succeed. It doesn't always look like that.
When Jo said 40,000, according to the Hamas health ministry, I think it's important to just remind people, according to a theocratic, sadistic dictatorship.
But the Israeli government doesn't disagree with, which the UN doesn't disagree with.
No, there are up to 20,000 of those might actually be Hamas terrorists
themselves. But we don't know,
right.
Zoe, for sure. And that's why we do those figures.
All right. So that's why we have to be careful when we throw around terms like 40,000, which then get taken up as evidence of war crimes, which is completely false.
But if
dropping
Benjamin,
the civilian population is a war crime, cutting off food and water is a war crime. They are war crimes.
Well, if Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't actually want to see, or there isn't enough support for a Palestinian state, what are the other alternatives to trying to solve this ongoing problem?
Jo, we've got to be really clear. There is no alternative to a two-state solution which is viable.
Has anyone here gone to Israel since October 7th? That's apart from me, who's been twice.
Well,
has anyone spoken to the people who are from very left-wing pro-Palestine kibbutzes that were the victims of these massacres? And has anyone asked them if they think they still believe in a two-state solution? Well, I have, and they all say they did. They were passionately committed to it, and there's no way they can have one now. They would never trust unless a huge...
Well, and that is a problem.
Just in response to the question, yes, I went in December to Kfar Assar, which was attacked where Emily Denari was taken. So, look, I recognise, I'm not pretending for one moment, Zoe, that there isn't...
They say, no way.
I'm not pretending for one moment that there isn't incredibly strong views in the Israeli population about what happens next. But if you ask me, is there a viable solution to the violence we're seeing in the Middle East, which does not involve a two-state solution with two peoples living in safety next to each other? There is no other solution, and we cannot pretend that there is. That is the only way. The reason it is such an enduring concept is it's the only way.
Well, I agree, but when? Soon or in a long time? Is it a short term or a long term?
Well, that depends on the parties involved, but the British government is going to be working as hard as we possibly can to get that as quickly as possible.
And all these groups, which are the existential threat to Israel, have got to acknowledge Israel's right to exist.
Right, and you're talking about Hezbollah and Hamas. I mean, is there a future for the Palestinians that is a secure, hopeful future with Hamas and Hezbollah still intact?
No, I don't think there is. And look, Hamas only sprung up because of the collapse of Fatah and indeed the breakdown of those processes. I mean, we could go through the history, but in the 90s. And, Hamas wasn't a factor back then, and that's why, or it was a very small factor back then, which is why we got close to that settlement. And unfortunately, the more secular, more democratic leadership of the Palestinian people was marginalised and wiped out in some cases. So, we have to get back to a position where there are people capable of negotiating peace on both sides, by the way, because there is not in Netanyahu and his far-right cabinet either. I'm sorry, but people like Smotrich
Yes,
and Ben
Ben
Gvir are no better than Nasrallah and the others.
Well, that's
and you look
clearly
at
false because they're not actually endorsing.
They are endorsing. Look what's going on in the West Bank.
With
They are
tunnels
absolutely. And
rapes
the head of Shin
and
Bet.
torture and
Hang on,
beheadings
Zoe.
and chemtrails.
There
So
are-
they are
hang on, Zoe.
different. I think it's really
Palestinian
important to say
prisoners
they're
have been
different.
raped
I agree that
repeatedly,
they're far.
institutionalised.
Okay, this is a lot
Hang
of
on,
fake
hang
news.
on.
We need to
Don't
really look
don't
into
talk
it.
over each other. But Zoe,
No, but I'm
hang on, Zoe.
concerned about the
The two
assertions
people
that Andrew's putting
yeah, well,
out
hang
here.
on,
They need to be
hang on.
checked.
The two people
There's
hang on a
systemic
second. The two people that Andrew mentioned have been accused of encouraging and fueling division and violence in the West Bank. Now
That's different stuff.
well,
Sinwar,
yeah,
please.
but
Are you saying that
no?
Smotrich
But I'm
and
just saying about
Sinwar
those
are
two
the same?
people.
I mean,
We're not
that's
going to
not-
have a tit-for-tat comparisons, but that is the case. They have been accused of encouraging and fueling violence in
They
the
are
West Bank,
far-right people.
where a
That's
Palestinian
true.
where a Palestinian state is designated to be. What happens now from the UK's perspective? I mean, this is really about the US, isn't it? I mean, how much of a role does the UK government really play in this situation?
So I want to say a few things quickly. First is one of the things I've been working on over the last week, as have lots of my colleagues across government, is trying to make sure that British nationals and their dependents in Lebanon are able to leave the country. We have organised flights which has taken more than 340 people out. If you are a British national in Lebanon, please leave now. There are still commercial options. The UK has done everything it can to make sure that people can leave if they need to. And it's a volatile situation, so please leave immediately. We've also made a variety of announcements about aid, including £10 million for civilians in Lebanon affected by the escalation of violence. But more generally, Jo, of course, I'm not claiming that we are the single power that is going to determine this in the Middle East, but we are using all of our efforts, along with our partners, to call for de-escalation, because it is in nobody's interest to end up in a further regional conflagration from where we are.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Independent. Boris Johnson says terrible Chagos Islands deal makes UK look pathetic. This follows the UK saying it'll hand over sovereignty of the islands in the Indian Ocean to Mauritius after a decades-long dispute. Do you agree with Boris Johnson, Harriet?
I think it's an absolutely terrible situation, and one that I hope we will be able to vote against in Parliament. It's not something that the government had an elected mandate to do. It's an absolutely terrible deal on the face of it. We don't know enough about it yet, but we've got a statement or an urgent question in Parliament later today, and we will oppose this deal.
You were in the Foreign Office when the negotiations were launched, weren't you? How can
No,
you?
I was not. And
OK, well, the Conservatives launched the negotiations. What did you think was going to happen if there wasn't going to be a deal at the end of it?
Well, we do not.
You had 11 rounds. What did you hope would happen at the end of those 11 rounds?
We didn't announce this deal, did we? So there
so
we
you
go. I
started
think
it and you failed to conclude it, and now you're upset that we did.
Answers your
Well,
own
let's
question, which was we didn't agree to this.
Right, well, actually, it's not just Harriet Baldwin and Boris Johnson and Conservatives. Labour MP Peter Lamb tweeted this. This is very disappointing. The decision over the future of the islands belongs to the Chagosian people. It's not for the UK to bargain away. 60 years on from their exile, they've been let down again. Hamish?
So the government is taking steps to try and make sure that the Chagosian people have a right to return to both to Diego Garcia and the other islands. I mean, we have in all things tried to make sure that we are complying with international law. The view of the advisory opinion in the International Court of Justice was this was a matter that needed to be negotiated between the UK and Mauritius, and that's what we've done. I know Peter, I understand his strong feelings and that of his constituents, and I hope that we'll be able to help the Chagosian people, but international law was pretty clear on where the negotiations needed to happen.
Andrew?
We forcibly expelled 2,000 people from the Chagos Islands in 1968. They have, under international law, both actually in the British courts in 2000 and in the International Court of Justice in 2018, I believe, the right to return. And it's good that we've negotiated this deal with Mauritius that enables that. I think it's bad, as Peter Lamb points out, that the Chagosian people weren't party to those negotiations themselves. It should be. I'm surprised to hear Harriet say this is a terrible deal. It preserves the military base, which I personally would oppose being there, because that's on the largest island, the most inhabitable part of the Chagos Islands, which has been a US and UK air base ever since since the 70s actually it was built. So, you know, they were expelled for that. We do not have the right to go around the world expelling people to build military bases for other countries.
All right.
So it's correcting a very long historic wrong. Has it been done in the perfect way? No, it hasn't.
Very briefly, because we've got seconds.
Very briefly, I have to say, it's not 2,600 rockets, it's 26,000 rockets.
Zoe,
I have to correct that.
it's very...
Now, no, that's a very
You've literally
important
got 5
correction.
seconds.
I think in this case, self-determination would have been better. I was worried about a slippery slope,
All right.
but I don't think that's going to happen.
That's all we have time for. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.